Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, October 3rd, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the national generic ballot, and it's shifting towards being a narrower and narrower race 1 month out until the November midterm elections. A new poll today from Monmouth University shows the Republican Party leading by about 2 points overall. Rasmussen reports has the GOP up by 1, Trafalgar has Republicans up by 5, The Economist and YouGov has Republicans up by 1, Susquehanna agrees with that characterization. Politico Morning Consult have the Democrats ahead by 2. Grinnell and Seltzer have the Democrats ahead by 4. CBS News, GOP plus 1. Emerson, tie, and ABC News, Republicans plus 5. These are the recent polls on Real Clear Politics, which average out to a Republican lead of just 1 percentage point. On the generic ballot level on 538, the Democrats, on the other hand, are leading by about 1.2%, but altogether it's about a 2.2% difference between these two sites. Altogether, 1 point leads for both parties show that the race is getting narrower, and it's getting to a point where it's getting closer than it was just a month ago. Now, the trend of the generic ballot from August onward was that the Democratic Party was reclaiming their electoral advantage, at least on the national level when it came down to nationwide generic vote. And while that was an indicator, it was not necessarily the biggest one that it was going to continue this way. The Democratic Party really only led by significant amounts back in early of 2021, and that's when very few polls were actually considered, and the Republican Party was hovering around the high 39s. Realistically, that was never going to happen. Looking at the numbers now, both parties are around a point where there are so few undecided voters. About 9% of the electorate claims to be undecided. What we've seen, historically speaking, is that those undecided voters do shift towards the GOP, but at the same time, Democrats are still larger in terms of their lead or larger in terms of their vote share than where they were back in the months of March, April, May, June, July, and going into early August. You can see for months on end, Democrats at different points in time actually hovered around 41% of the vote. We're at 42 for a very long period of time and now are at 45.4%, nearing 46%. There has been an increase for Democrats. But that isn't to say that Democrats haven't had higher points. They had a 2-point lead back on September 23rd, and today that has reduced itself. Not super dramatically, but certainly has reduced itself enough that it's noticeable. Democrats led on the Real Clear Politics average by about 1 point nationwide back in middle of September, and today Republicans now maintain a 1-point lead. For months on end, the Republican Party had a lead throughout all of 2022. They had a 9-month lead consecutively across the generic ballot for the GOP. You can see it here, which did narrow down. It got closer, and it is still very much closer. But it is tightening away from the Democratic Party towards the GOP. But together, it's a 1-point race, which means it's extremely, extremely narrow, and just a simple shift inside the margin of error could mean these polls are entirely incorrect or even more correct than what they are indicating. And by that I mean more Republican, or in the case of 538, more Democrat. This has also become the case when we've looked at forecasts across this country. We are getting to a point where politics is now becoming stagnant. When you take a look at my own predictions, you don't see much of a change. And honestly, that's because you don't expect to see much of a change when you have the races coming to the final close. You're not going to see the state of Indiana all of a sudden become competitive in the final month of the campaign season. If that was going to happen, it would have happened a while back. The same case for the Democratic Party. You're not going to see all of a sudden California become a competitive race. Same thing goes with some of these swing states. Ohio and Iowa are states that the Democratic Party might like to have, but realistically are not going to win. Democrats also seem to have locked down New Hampshire and Colorado, and while for periods of time we're under consideration that, hey, they might go to the GOP, there's a possibility that it does, we do not find that to be true now. And looking at the data, looking at the trend over time, you have seen American politics in a very similar way that you have over the past 2 years. Not much changing outside of our typical close and competitive states, especially more recently. We have seen a reduction in terms of certainty across both chambers of Congress, across the House and the Senate, which again indicates that our races are narrowing. They are getting closer and closer to 50%, and they are steadily declining away from the Democratic Party in the Senate and away from the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. Point is, the Democrats now have a 31% chance at the House. They have a 67% chance at the Senate. And you can see here that we are getting closer to being more competitive than the otherwise very obvious trend for months on end, with Democrats increasing in the Senate. The House, they still are increasing, but it shows that the race is getting closer and neither party is taking it away strongly in either chamber of Congress. Looking at our average seats controlled by party, it's more exemplified on the House level. We can explore it on the Senate level, but you really are not going to see that much. Democrats went from a point where they were losing 51 to 49 to now a point where they are leading 51 to 49. But on the House level, you're seeing more than just a 2-seat shift. The Republican Party at one point in time had 238 seats. Average controlled by party were expected to win the popular vote by 6.4%. Democrats had just 197. Today, Democrats are at 210. Republicans are at 225. And Republicans are expected to win by 2.5% on average in the popular vote margin rather than 6 points, which is what it was. So again, closer and closer and closer. The race is getting closer, and ultimately, the Republican Party is still, by 538's metric, expected to win the popular vote, which means it actually aligns a bit more with the Real Clear Politics generic congressional vote than what 538 is telling us. But sometimes these models forecast far out in advance and make determinations simply based off of where they expect things to be, not where they are today, which could be a reason why the generic ballot lead for Democrats is 1.2%, or they expect the polls to be underestimating the Republican Party when it comes down to the popular vote. I'm not entirely sure what way to really take this or what to take away from this circumstance, but I do think that is the way that we should look at it and understand that our House forecast, our Senate forecast is getting closer, and both parties are getting to a point where they are converging in terms of chances and getting closer and closer and closer. I also think when we take a look at our traditionally competitive states, especially on the Senate level, they are reverting to be competitive as they were. Not to say that they weren't competitive before, but there were times in which John Fetterman, the Democratic candidate for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania, was leading by 12 points statewide in the state, which never really made much sense. Pennsylvania was never going to vote for a Democrat in an open seat by 12 percentage points, even against Dr. Oz. This race was always going to be competitive, and the fact that it is getting closer and closer to the campaigns being ended, of course it's going to become more competitive just by the understanding of polling data and the last-minute solidification of both party sides in polling data. What I mean by that is Dr. Oz at different points polled around 36, 37% of the vote. In no reality was John Fetterman getting 63% of the vote in a seat with a Republican incumbent on a statewide Senate level in a state President Biden only won by 1. This is a competitive state, and the polls are reflecting that now, and all of a sudden, people are saying it's a super monumental shift. Yes, going to do so. Anytime anyone would ever try to take the polling data at face value and say explicitly Fetterman was going to win by 12, every time I made a video talking about it, I recognized that a 12-point lead was entirely unrealistic. And when you take a look at my forecast here, I never once had Pennsylvania as more than lean Democrat. And today, it's actually less than that. So looking at my Pennsylvania numbers, looking at a lot of other states, swing states at the end of the day, and even though one party, Republican or Democrat, may have had a lead that was larger previously or expected to have a somewhat large lead, they are reverting back to their roots, which means they are competitive states. Ohio is another example of that. President Trump was an excellent candidate for the GOP. But when you take him away and you take away the popular Republican incumbent and you put it back to being an open race, as much as Ohio does lean red and will likely vote for the Republican Party as I expect it to do so, it's still going to be competitive. That's the way that things are. And the same thing applies to our national generic ballot. I will also say that again, as we get closer to Election Day, voters become more decisive as to who they are going to select. It is not truly percent of the vote to the Republican Party's 44.2. There's going to be nudging up in favor of both parties in terms of their respective vote share that will bring them closer to 50. Because that's the way American politics is. We are in a two-party system, and that is what we should expect from our national results. And the polls are showing an increase in support. Again, do you remember the time I showed you where the Democrats were hovering around 41% of the vote? Well, Republicans were only at 42. Right? When you look at the numbers from July 2021, the Democrats were at 43.4. Today, they are better, but their overall lead was about 4 points nationwide. Republicans, on the other hand, were at just 39%. We've seen this happen in the past as well, not necessarily to the same extent because Democrats started out with larger leads. But as they got closer to Election Day, especially in the final weeks, I mean, you can see here, Democrats never cracked 50 until the final stretch of the campaign season, literally the final week of Election Day. Democrats started out with the generic ballot lead in April 2019, 45 to 39. But the Democrats realistically were never going to get just 45% of the vote, and Republicans realistically were never going to get just 39% of the vote. So as we got closer and closer to Election Day, the numbers started to increase. But that's because 2020, in many regards, was a good year for the Democratic Party. Same thing in 2018, but Democrats had a larger lead in 2018. But again, it was the final stretch of the campaign season that forced voters to make a decision and tell it how they actually wanted to vote. Democrats led by 8.6%. That's how much they won by in terms of the actual results. But when you look at their earlier numbers, Democrats at different points in the start of the polling season were at 43.7% to the Republican Party's 39.6%. Isn't that quite interesting? I mean, taking a look, the Democrats did get closer to 50% a lot earlier than the Democrats are right now, but it is not unknown or lost on us that there are times in reality in which both parties are hovering around this point. I will admit it's a lot later in the game, but that's because truly too, we are looking at a year that is likely going to be mediocre for both parties. That's why the Senate is narrowing up. That's why the House is narrowing up. That's why the betting markets are narrowing up. Again, we are in a point where we are working with a mediocre year for both parties. You know what another mediocre year was for both parties? 2016 in terms of the generic ballot. Republicans did win the House, and that's because of congressional gerrymandering and just luck and incumbency factors, whatever it might be. But Democrats led by about 0.6%. Republicans ultimately ended up winning by about 1.1%. But the polls showed us where we are right now, a mediocre year where no one could agree on an overall majority. That's why the polling numbers were 46 to 45, but the final numbers jumped up to 49-48. That's more than a 9-point undecided group. That means about just 3% of the electorate did not vote, or less than that, vote for Democrats or Republicans, not 9%. There's a big difference when you look at that. Looking at 2014, for instance, though, or 2012, this again was a somewhat mediocre year for both parties. Neither party really took it away when it came down to the generic ballot, but again, under 50% is the main line. But looking at wave years, on the other hand, you start to see where better numbers come into play. 2014 was an anomaly, and we talk about this one simply because the polling data indicated that it would be more competitive than it actually was, but that also was a complete and egregious polling error by the major pollsters of the time, just as 2016 was, but it was quite accurate, quite honest with you, in 2018, but in 2020, it was slightly off. Polling is never fully accurate. It's never going to be fully accurate. And I think looking at our historical data can be indicators, of where we are and what we should expect for the entirety of our midterm elections. But we shouldn't put all of our faith in it because of the reasons that I just explained to you in terms of historical inaccuracies. But 2010 was a brilliant showing for polling data. Yes, there was an under expectation for Democrats on this front, but it did show the Republicans at 51%. But this was a good year for the GOP. They picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives. It was a phenomenal year, and they led by 9.4% by the final polls. Gallup had Republicans ahead by 15 points nationwide. But even in this circumstance, the polls underestimated the true actual vote share for both parties. The margin was off, but still, Democrats got more of the vote than 41%, and Republicans got more of the vote than 51%. Looking, though, at the polls, you will see that it was truly a Labor Day bump. Really, that's where you started to see a major takeaway, but a summer bump for the Republican Party. You saw the Republicans go to a point where they started to lead, and they started to take it away. They neared 50%. Democrats came into this starting at 50%, which is what the major difference is here. Democrats came into 2009 with an 11-point lead nationwide. Democrats were very happy about that, a 13-point lead on the national generic ballot. But as Obama became unpopular and Paul Ryan and John Boehner and Republicans all across the nation rose to popularity, rose to recognition, Michelle Bachmann, etc., you can see here that as time went on, the Republican Party started to increase. The Republican Party started to get closer and closer to 51%. So it looks like in many regards that 2022 is shaping out to be a year similar to 2012 or similar to 2016, which would favor the GOP because it means they win control of the House. Democrats have only been able to win control of the House in two instances in the past 10 years, 2018 and 2020. And the way that happened wasn't super easy. You look at the vote margin, it was a 3-point margin. Democrats are only leading by 1, and they led by 7 in the polls. In 2018, it took them an 8-point margin to flip back the seats. That happened based off the polling indicators, but looking at that, it took an 8-point margin of victory to flip back the House. It doesn't take just a 1-point victory. You can ask the Democrats back in 2012 when they in fact won the popular vote by 1 percentage point, yet lost the House of Representatives by over 30 seats. That's the reality we are shaping up to be in, and that's the one we've practically been in for the past few months. But as it does get closer, and Democrats and Republicans get closer and closer to narrowing in on each other, the Democrats come to a point where they could potentially win more than 201 seats, but Republicans also come very close to winning control of the Senate. Our generic ballot is a perfect indicator of this narrowing up on the national level, and it's something that we definitely could have expected, but it means that the Democratic Party's consistent and clear rise to popularity and increased improvement has halted, plateaued, and right now, in fact, converging back to being closer and closer to the GOP. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.